Welcome to the Moved to Meditate podcast. I'm your host, Addie D. Hilster. This is a place for vibrant discussions about mindfulness, movement practices, and ways to find more balance and presence in daily life. Here you'll find resources to help you progress on your path, as well as insightful conversations with mindful movement, yoga, meditation, and Dharma teachers from a range of traditions. On this podcast, we spotlight embodied approaches to mindfulness and the more contemplative aspects of movement practice. Listen in and connect to a community of like-minded practitioners. Hello there. Thanks for joining me today for a new episode of the podcast. Today we have a conversation with Neil Pearson about how yoga and mindfulness can help you improve pain, understand your body's signals better, and find relief. This episode will have lots of useful information if you're someone who lives with pain and you're wondering how yoga or mindfulness could help. I think you will really appreciate Neil's hopeful and empowering message that yes, we can change our pain. It's also a great listen if you teach movement or meditation and you want to better serve your students who may be coming to class to cope with pain, or you want to know how to handle it when someone experiences pain during class. Neil Pearson is just the person to answer your questions since he's a physical therapist, yoga therapist, author, and pain care advocate. He conducts research into the effects of yoga on veterans with chronic pain and people with osteoarthritis. Neil brings the academic, clinical, and yoga worlds together in his roles as a clinical associate professor at the University of British Columbia, as a faculty member in 3 yoga therapy schools, and as a board member for the International Association of Yoga Therapists. He co-authored the book Yoga and Science in Pain Care in 2019 and authored the patient education book Understand Pain, Live Well Again in 2008. His wife Lisa Pearson is an ordained Swami in the Kriya Yoga lineage, and together they founded the Pain Care Aware platform, which brings pain science education to the yoga community. In this interview with Neil, you'll hear why he's taken this approach of integrating yoga and mindfulness with pain science, how movement changes pain by retraining the nervous system and influencing inflammation, why it's beneficial to turn towards pain with awareness rather than trying to downplay or ignore it, and why improving pain takes more than just finding the physical cause and fixing the tissues. Neil explains some of the counterintuitive aspects of how pain works so we can move away from outdated concepts that may limit our potential recovery. We talk about the impact of dramatic negative language like this joint is bone on bone or this disc is shredded. He also talks about how yoga can provide a direct experience of being able to change your pain, which can be a powerful counterpoint to some of our common misconceptions. There's also an interesting bit towards the end where he talks about autonomic synchrony and how practicing yoga or mindfulness in a group may be beneficial for pain reduction because of the way our nervous systems affect each other when we're with others. Be sure to check the podcast page on my website and look for episode 84 to find the resources that Neil mentioned during this conversation, as well as the links to his work at Pain Care Aware. Those can all be found at movedtomeditate.yoga/podcast. And before we hear this interview, I'd like to give a quick shout out about my upcoming course, Ease into Meditation, because it's getting ready to start this Sunday, January 28th. This is my take on an 8-week intro to mindfulness course, but the twist is that we learn all the mindfulness skills first through movement rather than sitting still. The course covers the same mindfulness principles and many of the same techniques that you'd find in most beginner-level mindfulness courses. But the idea was to bring those to life through movement. If you feel like having to sit still is holding you back from learning mindfulness, this might be for you. Or if you have a meditation practice, but it still feels like you're up in your head a lot, these lessons are designed to help you find a more embodied mindfulness. You do this course on your own schedule, but we're all starting together on January 28th and following the same lesson plan for 8 weeks. There's more information on my website at movedtomeditate.yoga. Just look for the Ease into Meditation course in the menu or find the link to it in this episode's podcast notes. And if you're hearing this later and the course sounds interesting, but you think you missed it, I encourage you to still check the website anyway to see when it might be running again. Okay, with that, let's head into this informative and optimistic interview about pain with Neil Pearson. Welcome, everyone. Thanks for being here today, and thanks for checking out this episode of the podcast. I'm really excited to be speaking today with Neil Pearson, who is a physical therapist and a yoga therapist and a pain care advocate. And I would say that in my experience being around this, movement and yoga world for quite a while, Neil has been someone who's played a really big role in bringing up-to-date information about pain to the yoga and movement community. And so I've been following his work for quite a while. And last summer, I finally took the Pain Care Aware Foundations course for my yoga therapy CEUs, and that inspired me to reach out and see if Neil would be willing to come on the podcast. So here we are. Welcome, Neil.
Thanks, Annie. It's a real pleasure to be here.
Thank you so much. Can you just start by telling us a little bit about your background and what brought you into this work of pain care and addressing pain
Mm,
through yoga?
yeah, quite a while ago now. I started being a physiotherapist in 1985, and really very quickly in my career, patients were telling me about their pain, and what they said didn't make any sense based on what I learned in school. And so that got me thinking that maybe what I learned in school wasn't quite right. Apparently, what I was supposed to do is think, oh, they're just an outlier. They're just not, they just don't fit into the pattern. But I started to wonder whether the patterns I had heard about or learned about in school were not there, and started to look. And so in the mid 80s, there really were, we'd have to say, nothing out there except for the textbook of pain by Milzak and Wall. There were some other people writing a little bit, but nobody was really focused on it. The 1980s could be called the decade of the biomechanical spine idea about pain. Like all the research was around the spine and trying to
Mm,
figure out like the source. So anyway, people kept on telling me about their pain, and I started to just start to go different places to learn. And then there started to be more people starting to write on it in the 1990s, but still not a lot. I went back and did my master's because I wanted to learn more, but that ended up being more focused on biomechanics than anything else because that's where the people were looking. But I just kept on having this interest and this interest, and then actually in 1997 I moved to Vancouver, and shortly after I got there, I had an opportunity to start working at a pain management center,
mm,
and that really changed everything. But at the same time as I started working at the pain management center, someone asked me, well, a lot of people in Vancouver were suggesting I should probably do yoga. And that was because they knew my interest in pain. They knew me as a physiotherapist, and they also knew me as somebody who dabbled in meditation. And
mm,
so this one Vipassana meditation teacher in Vancouver had said, well, if you like exercise and you like meditation, you should do yoga. And there's something about the way that he said it that got me to go try. And I sort of had one of those, fall in love with it right away because it's like, this is really cool. I get to meditate and move at the same time. So that really brought me in there. But what I started to see, because I had the luck of ending up in a yoga studio where they really taught yoga philosophy while
mm-hmm.
they were teaching you the asanas, the movements. Um, because they did that, I started to realize that what I was hearing there sounded a whole lot like what I was hearing in the pain management program. So, like all the things that we were trying to do with people in the pain management program seemed very, very similar to what yoga philosophy was saying, and that's sort of what brought me more fully into it, and been in that world since then, really since around 2000.
That's really interesting to sort of go back in time and think about the pieces you would have been putting together because we now have the benefit of others who come before who have integrated things like yoga and pain science, and you didn't have that. So you had to sort of see the connections and figure
Mhm.
out what to do with that.
Exactly. Yeah. And it was, I think I'm still trying to find some of these connections, right? But I think I think the advantage it gave me more than anything was that it taught me to listen to the lived experiences of pain in a different way. Because what I was, taught in school was to listen for the biomechanical or the biomedical, and not really listen to the whole person approach, which became very obvious working in the pain management center and practicing yoga and learning yoga philosophy, that this more whole person approach made a lot more sense.
Absolutely. Um, One thing that I really appreciate about your work is the message that we can actually influence our pain. And for those of us involved in yoga or movement or mindfulness practices, it is quite empowering, or I found it empowering to learn that we actually have a lot of tools here that naturally lend themselves to addressing pain. So, could you give a few examples of how you've used yoga practices to
Mm.
influence pain? Which I know is a huge question for you, but maybe a few examples.
Sure. Um, I think I'd have to start with what's probably the most powerful one is it's movement. When we can find a way to move with more ease, or to be more active, or you might say to do more exercise, the changes that happen in us are extraordinary when we actually succeed with it. It's difficult to succeed, but once you do, you change your nervous system, you change your immune system. I mean, you're changing astrocytes and microglia in your brain and your spinal cord and your muscles that change. What happens is they change the chemistry that they release. So a lot of these immune cells can release pro-inflammatory chemistry, and some of them can produce anti-inflammatory chemistry. And so the getting people to move with more ease starts to shift the immune cells to be more anti-inflammatory chemistry releasers. So movement does it. I think one of the other big, really important ones is the practice of awareness. So we know that the experience of pain makes you basically turn away from the pain. Like, why
Hmm.
would you go look at? Why would you spend time with it? And so we try to run away. We try to avoid. We try to not pay attention to it. And unfortunately, what we find is that those activities actually once again change the way your physiology works. And so even within, if we go to the mental health area, it's very clear that um, to get better, at some point, you need to be able to turn and look towards the pain, to find a safe place or a safe container where you can actually, like look at it and learn about it really. And I know that sounds really goofy to when I say this to people who have chronic pain, like they're looking at me as like, really, this is what you want me to do? It's a little bit like breathing. We know that breathing is so effective, and we know more of that from what patients have said than anywhere else, that the act of calm breathing is so powerful. And we haven't fully sorted that out in terms of what's happening in the body, but we know that certainly the even something as simple as when you breathe out with a little bit more length, while you're doing that, you're actually reinforcing the parasympathetic nervous system, or that the rest digest part of your nervous system where everything can calm down. And typically, pain makes you not breathe that way. And just sort of one interesting thing about the breathing bit is that at the beginning of pain management programs, um, probably the thing we hear the most is that, really, breathing, this is what you want me to do? Didn't you hear what I told you was wrong with me? And then at the end of it, when we ask people, what do you think was the most important thing for you to do, or most powerful thing? And often it is the learning how to breathe in a more calm way while you're moving.
I love this conversation because you're connecting a lot of dots of, for people who come into you at first and they're like, really breathing? What does that have to do with anything? I told you my back hurts. Right. And also these pieces of the practices that we're so familiar with that are,
Mhm.
they're there in any practice, right? The awareness, the breath, the movement, and when done with intention, that these could be so powerful for addressing or alleviating or even preventing pain. I
Hmm.
think is really important, because there are these benefits of the yoga practice that I don't think get enough of the spotlight. And it's not
Hmm.
necessarily what people in popular culture think of when they think of yoga. And yet, this could be such a
Absolutely.
powerful set of tools.
Hmm. And it seems that the chemistry changes that happen inside us when we do, say, mindfulness versus slow breathing versus exercise. It's probably not the wrong word to, or it's the wrong word to have in there versus, but when you do those different things, there's a different chemistry change in the body. And that's, I think, really an important thing to hear is sometimes we tell people that there is a medicine cabinet inside us. Actually, so that's something I learned from David Butler, as a physiotherapist in Australia. This idea that, hey, there's a medicine cabinet inside you, and you can actually open it up in different ways. So when you're practicing mindfulness, you're opening up in one way. When you practice calm breath, you do it in a different way. When you move your body this way, you move it in a different way, which is part of the, I think, the really great stuff to learn. If there are multiple mechanisms inside us that can change pain, which that's what we're seeing, then we have to click into the idea that sometimes people tell us that when the pain's really bad, the only way they can calm the pain down is to actually put those mechanisms together.
Hmm.
So, and the way I learned it really, really well was, and this is not that many years ago, this patient said, when my hip's sore, I get in the bath and I feel better. But when my hip's really sore, that doesn't work. I need to get the water temperature just right. I need to put in the right amount of Epsom salts. I light a candle and gaze at it. I put on aromatherapy and I listen to Enya, and now my pain gets better. And it was, in that moment, I know I've heard other people say things like this, but in that moment, I realized she told me she was stacking or layering together different mechanisms of pain relief.
Mm.
And it's really nice that the science is starting to show that you can change pain with endorphins, with your autonomic nervous system, with hormones, with the immune system, dopamine, serotonin. You can sort of keep the list going on. There's so many different chemicals inside us we can change that would help to influence how much pain we have.
And the ways we can do that are fairly simple if we know a little bit about it,
Hmm.
which is pretty amazing to know. Um, in the training, this I think connects to this piece in the training where you spoke about awareness practices and regulation practices, and that you use both, and that there is a distinction between the two. So I wonder if you could say a few words about that.
Sure. So, awareness practices people who practice mindfulness as a practice of being aware. So, you're not intending on changing anything or regulating anything. I mean, in mindfulness, you're sort of regulating your thoughts a little bit, but the idea is that you're trying to just see what happens, see what comes up. And so, whereas regulation practices are the practices of changing things. So, breathe longer, contract the muscle harder, whatever it is. And so, if you go to your usual yoga class, you'll often hear the teacher ask you to be aware of something, and almost within seconds, there's that now change it. So
Hmm.
take your attention to your feet. Okay, now do this with your feet. Right. So you don't get a lot of time to actually stay in the awareness part in most yoga classes. Not all, but in most. And so one of the things that I actually learned in business in the management world is you can't manage something if you can't measure it. And
Uh-huh.
so managing it would be the regulation and measuring it would be the awareness bit. So if you don't really know what's going on, how do you know how to change it? And so this idea came to me, and I started to play with this more and more with people with chronic pain, and started to realize that some people, when they start to do practices that are about awareness, especially breath awareness and body tension awareness or body sensation awareness, that those practices in and of themselves can be wildly powerful for changing pain. And certainly the research around mindfulness has shown that they can be. But then there's the regulation practices would be like breathe longer, or change, which nostril you're breathing in and out of, whatever it is, you're now regulating your breath on purpose. And that there are some people when you start that those are the techniques that work best at the beginning. And there often seems to be this shift as you continue to work with people that you'll start to get the other one having a positive effect, or putting them two together would be even better. But anyway, I think our thinking is to change something, you need to change something. So if I want to change my pain, I need to change my breath,
Mm-hmm.
right?
What
And
I'm doing
so,
must be wrong, so I better do something different.
right. And so the practice of mindfulness tells us that the technique of observing is actually a change agent in and of itself. And for some
Hmm.
people, it's very, very powerful.
Yeah, I talk about this with my students in terms of observation versus enhancement mode, and that we need to take time to observe what we're doing. Even after we make a change, we shift something in the alignment, we'll pause. What does this feel like
Mhm.
before you make the next change? And to make more space for observation, I think, is part of what makes it more of a mindfulness practice when we're moving. And
Mhm.
it's a simple way to weave the two together and really kind of toggle back and forth between being more in observation or awareness and more on the regulation, or enhancement side,
Mhm.
so to
I like
speak.
that. That's great. Yeah, it's saying a very similar thing, right?
Yeah, yeah. No, I think it has interesting applications for our practice, and it's
Hmm.
neat to hear about it in terms of how it can help people with managing or relating differently to pain.
Hmm.
So I wanted to ask you some basic things about pain and pain science,
Sure.
because as I've had the chance to study this a bit, I've really learned that there are a lot of popular misunderstandings about pain in the general public, and even it's the case, I think, that some of the things, in the way that pain behaves, they're just kind of counterintuitive at first.
Hmm.
So one of the fundamental ones I think that comes up a lot, um, is that this idea that we have pain nerves that get activated when something hurts us, and then they send pain signals to a pain center in the brain. Can you tell us what's wrong with that?
Right.
Everything?
Well, most of it. I mean, the idea of it moving from the body, something moving from the body towards the brain, that's good. So if we call the nerves in our body pain nerves, then what we're actually saying is that those nerves are sending pain signals from the body to the brain. And what science is very, very clear about is that those nerves they can't actually send you a thing called pain. They send a signal. And what we call it, well, we just have to sort of make that up. Because some people say it's just a message, other people say it's a danger message, other people say it's a warning message. And there are a lot of people who have started to call them danger neurons or danger nerves, thanks to Lorimer Moseley and David Butler, who really sort of coined that idea. It's because these nerves are, their job is to detect dangerous or potentially dangerous things in our skin and our body. And so they pay attention to mechanical force, like if something gets stretched too hard or squeezed too hard. And they also get excited by or respond to potentially dangerous thermal things. Things are way too hot, things that are way too cold. And they also get excited by chemical irritants. So, like if you stick a pin in my finger, cells break, they release chemicals, and that gets these nerves fired. Or if I sprain my ankle and tear the ligament, right, again, it's a chemical thing. Anyway, to come back to that, I'm saying the nerves can get excited by mechanical force and chemical stuff and by temperature stuff. The very same nerve gets excited in the very same way by each of those three things. And it sends the very same signal, right? So you would think that there would be a different nerve for each one of those things because your experience of each one of those things is very different. But it's
Hmm.
the same nerve sending the same signal. It heads up towards the spinal cord. It needs to get nerves in your spinal cord excited and send messages up to your brain. And then when it gets up to your brain, what your brain has to do is decide what exactly happened. And you would think it's actually just getting a pain signal that says, hey, there was something, a pin just got stuck in your finger, right? But the signal is just saying, hey, something dangerous happened out in your body in that area. And then weirdly enough, the rest of the brain needs to sort out what actually happened and how should it feel, which is all very odd. But what it's coming down to, as I say all that, is that the signal from the body, when it gets to the brain, some mechanism related to the brain and the body together is deciding if you get pain, which I think is really weird, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because we've been really led to believe that pain is an input to the brain. But what we now know is that pain is actually something that the organism, and using the brain within the organism, right? So I'll say brain because it's easier, right? But when the signals get to the brain is um, deciding if you need to have pain. And if the brain sort of, I know it sounds weird because when I say it's deciding, it's almost sounding like there's another person inside the brain deciding, but some mechanism of your brain is producing pain, yes or no, right? And so it is, and so the pain is actually something that the brain is producing to protect you. The body is sending some signal, so we'll call it a danger signal, up towards the spinal cord, up towards the brain to tell you that there's something dangerous happening. And then if there's a determination that there is something really dangerous happening, then you get the pain. The brain actually produces that, which I think is part of what is really sort of in the common language. We hear people talking about how pain causes muscle spasm or pain causes other things in you. And what we need to recognize is that pain is a way your body protects you. It gets you to change your behavior. Well, muscle spasm does too, right? If you're muscle
Mm-hmm.
spasm, that's a protection mechanism. But we hear this language, and this is another misconception, the language that pain causes muscle spasm. Well, they actually are both outputs of the brain to protect you. They sort of happen together. But then, of course, once you experience them, it gets really weird, right? Because muscle spasm can cause pain, which can cause more muscle spasm, and you get into these sort of vicious loops. Anyway, that was a long answer to your question with that misconception, but
That's
hopefully it
very
makes some sense.
helpful. Yeah, it does. And I think the thing is, it just happens so quickly that we cannot
Hmm.
perceive all the steps in that process. So,
Hmm.
I stub my toe, I go, ow, pain,
Right.
right? It's just so fast. And so it's interesting for us to know more about the whole
Hmm.
process. And so this signal, this event happens in the body that sends some kind of warning signal, or hey, check this out signal, up to the brain. And then it's getting filtered through what, they're like different
Oh gosh.
memories, emotions, like
Mm,
how is it sorting this out?
right. Well, and it gets there's this added complexity of it. Is when when it happens in your, especially when it happens in your skin, but all through most of your body. When you have something happen in your body and the signals are sent up, they're actually sent up through two different pathways that sort of go up together. And when they get to the brain, one pathway heads into the emotional part of your brain, the old emotional part of your brain first. And the other pathway does this sort of long path through a bunch of different places up to the where we think things come to our consciousness part of your brain, like in the
Mm,
cortex, the sensory cortex. So you've got these two pathways. One's basically giving you a signal that has more to do with where the problem is and the intensity of it, and but the other one's looking. It's like it's going to this old part of your brain where we think it's like a part of your brain going, has this ever happened before? What did it mean when it happened before? How dangerous was it? And but it's always doing this so that, as you said, it's not only fast, but at the same time, it's turning on the parts of your brain that tell you that there's something going on. It's also engaging the emotional part of your brain, the
mm-hmm,
parts of your brain that are predicting what's going to happen in the future and what happened in the past. So this becomes really fascinating to me because you cannot have a sensation of pain without any emotion. These two things are always together. But again, of course, we talk about how pain makes you changes your emotion. But anyway, as the signal gets up there, it's going up through these areas. But when we look at brain activity when people have pain, when a person says, ouch, the idea 150 years ago was that there's a part of your brain that's the pain center. And then
mm-hmm.
those pain signals would go up to the part of your brain that's the pain center. We were so convinced of it that we did lobotomies on people, 100 years ago to try to actually destroy the anterior cingulate cortex, which is part of the brain that has to do with attention. It's also part of the brain that gets excited when you feel pain. And when we look at brain scans, um, I think the number is between 200 and 400 parts of your brain get excited when you say ouch. So when you have pain, it's not one part of your brain turning on, it's a whole bunch of your brain turning on together, more like a big orchestra playing a song.
That is fascinating. And,
Hmm.
particularly the part that you cannot have pain without having an emotional experience of pain. And I think that's one of the reasons mindfulness and the skill of observation is so important, because I know when I experience pain, one of the first things that starts happening is that train of thought of, oh no, am I going to be able to do this thing tomorrow? Is this going to get worse? Oh, what's going to happen if this goes on? How am I going to deal with this? Am I going to need to go to the doctor? And it's just like that cascade of thoughts. And that can actually, um, I find, make the pain worse, or at least make the stress around the pain a lot
Hmm.
worse.
Well, I think we're getting to the point where we would say it makes the pain worse. You know, I think there has been this tendency to psychologize pain a little bit and say that you're making the experience of pain worse,
Hmm.
as if no, it's the pain itself that's getting worse, because pain is a product of you. And
Mm.
if we take your autonomic nervous system, if we stress you out and we take your autonomic nervous system and shift it towards the sympathetic side, the fight flight side, it changes the chemistry of you so that you will have more pain in the vast majority of times. So it's not just you're changing your experience of it, right? Or changing the way you're emoting or thinking about it, it's changing the pain itself. And I think that's when you get back to that first misconception, or the misconception that we can't really change pain, which is really common. If our language doesn't shift well enough in the health sciences area, where we continue to talk about just changing a person's experience of the pain, not their pain, then that reinforces this idea is that pain is immutable. And I mean,
Hmm.
it's one of the other really beautiful things about practicing mindfulness is that you start to realize that everything changes. You know, and if you can find a way to observe the pain itself, and you can do that from a place of safety, you will quickly start to realize that its quality, its intensity, its location, everything about it is shifting, which is so freaky the first time you feel it, because pain feels solid and like it's a mass, right?
Hmm.
It's
Hmm.
weird. It's invisible, but it still feels like it's this solid thing, almost like you could take out and do something about.
So tangible,
Yeah. And then when you go and you look at it, you start to realize that it's actually not like that.
which is hopeful.
Exactly.
I think one of the biggest things, and this comes up sometimes with people that that I've worked with in my classes, or over the years, that I would love people to understand more, is that it's really not just about finding the physical problem and fixing that. And people often really want that tangible explanation of, oh, it's the state of my cartilage, or it's because my
Mhm.
posture, my alignment is off, or it's these shoes that I've been wearing, they're the wrong shoes, or, whatever that is. So, what would you say to a client or person who is looking for that, like, purely physical
Mm.
fix?
It's always going to depend on the client. But I think at some point I want to get the message to come around to is that pain is always multifaceted. So though we as you said, we want to look for the reason for it, we need to get to the spot where we realize that pain is produced by many, many things happening together. And so if we can start to get curious about the multifaceted nature of it, then if we can also open the door to the idea that if pain changes this, then can this change pain?
Hmm.
Right? So if my knee osteoarthritis, I have knee osteoarthritis, and if I have this and it's actually causing me to be anxious, and if it's causing my muscles to be weak, and if it's it's changing the way I'm thinking, the thought would be is that the only way to change what's happening with my pain would be to actually fix my knee. But if I understand that the knee osteoarthritis is causing anxiety and it's changing, say, my social network, I'm being more social isolated, and it's changing how much the muscle can contract around it. If I could actually work on regaining the ability to contract a muscle, start to re-engaging with my social network, start to change my anxiety, could that actually come back to the pain and change the pain? Right? So it's if we can open the door to it being multifaceted, can we also open the door to a bi-directional relationship between pain and everything else? Which I know it sounds so illogical, but it's the thing that we've realized is that, you know, if you've got something like knee osteoarthritis, yes, we may not be able to, fix up that cartilage like it was before. But that doesn't mean we can't change how much pain you have and how much ease of movement you have. If we do certain things, a lot of people actually start to find that they can walk and stand and move with less pain. And so if you can do that without fixing the tissue, then you start to realize that, right, pain is always multifaceted and you don't actually have to know precisely what's wrong. If I could take that one step further, the reason people want to know what's wrong is because people believe that if you don't know exactly what's wrong, you could never come up with the right solution.
You need the root cause, and
Right.
yeah, right.
Yeah. And I mean, if you practice mindfulness for a while and you practice yoga for a while and start to get into yoga philosophy, you have to start to ask the question of, you know, what is the reason that I'm having this pain? I may be attributing this to my alignment or, to something I did with my body, but I'm not just a body. This pain could have been influenced by so many things, and you start to, again, there you're thinking about the multifaceted nature. But part of the reason that people want to know from us as healthcare professionals what's wrong is because they believe you can't know what to do without knowing that. And so one of the things that when we're working with people, so say a person comes into the more typical pattern of low back pain, the person's looking for, what's wrong. But the reason they want to know that is because they actually want to know, do we know how to help them? And so you
Mm-hmm.
can actually skip the first part and go to the second bit. We see a lot of people with this kind of low back pain issue, and we know what to do to help you out. And when you actually say that to a lot of people, they forget about caring about exactly what's there. Or they might say, I know this stuff is what we need to do, but you know what's going on. But it's made them curious, right? It's sort of broken that cause effect line, which I think we need to do for a lot of people. Um, for those of you who are listening to know that I can't remember the number right now, but the vast majority of low back pain is non-specific, which
Mm-hmm.
means that if you try with the best testing procedures possible to figure out, is it the joint, is it the disc, is it the cartilage, all that stuff, you can't do it, right? It's non-specific, yet we have treatments that work really quite well for most people with acute low back pain. It's not as good with chronic low back pain, but acute low back pain we're pretty good at.
And it's not that helpful to be given a diagnosis that's called non-specific low back pain, right?
Exactly. Yeah, it wouldn't make any sense to do that, right? Well, I mean,
Yeah.
it makes even less sense to tell somebody that they've got a disc bulge or degenerative disc disease and all that stuff, right? Because if that's not a visual image of brokenness, I don't know what it is. Right?
Well, and isn't it the case that if you took most adults and gave us all MRIs, a lot of us would have disc bulges that we don't even know about because they're not creating a problem.
That's right. I mean, and that's the good news part, right? It means that you can have a big disc bulge and not have symptoms. And so the way we think that probably happened was that the disc started to bulge a little bit, and your protective mechanism sort of went, "Hey, what's going on? Oh, this is not a really big deal. Don't need to pay attention." And then it bulged a bit more, and they paid a bit of attention, but not very much, right? And so it slowly happened over time,
Mm-hmm.
which means that you can have a big disc bulge, and your protective mechanism or your nervous system can pretty much do that's okay. I don't need to tell you about that,
That's
right?
amazing.
And we see this that actually there are some people who have big disc bulges and they get better and they do an MRI on them a year later and they still have a big disc bulge, but they're better. The pain's gone, which again shows you that the physiology of our body has the capacity to adapt in a way that we would call positive, which is actually the reverse of chronic pain, is actually when it adapts in a way that we would call negative. And that the system adapted to become more sensitive, more reactive, send more signals, produce more protection, which is sort of wild, right? That
Mm-hmm.
when something happens to your body, your protective mechanisms, if you keep on doing the same thing to your body over and over again, the protective mechanism adapts either in a good way for you or not so good way. And if we go by the numbers, 20% of the time, it doesn't go in a good way. 20% of the population has chronic pain. So most times it actually adapts in the right way.
Hmm.
But there's like 20% of times when it doesn't.
This is so interesting to sort of decouple our image of like what is going on in the tissues determines everything.
Mm-hmm.
And somewhat related to that, a moment ago, you also talked about like the language that healthcare providers use and how important that is. And sometimes doctors use phrases that are really dramatic and really negative. And I've had students tell me, that they're the worst ever because
Mm-hmm.
their joint is bone on bone or their disc is shredded or
Yeah.
something that sounds really bad. And that language, I can see like by the way that they're reporting it that to them it means the pain is inevitable. And um that's particularly true when they're going from this paradigm of like
Mm-hmm.
what's happening mechanically is the determinant of my pain experience. So what you're saying is people can find relief from pain even if they've been told that their tissues are in really bad shape.
Yeah, there's a few things about that, right? If they've been told their tissues are in really bad shape and the person really believes that that is the 100% cause of their pain, it's going to be a lot harder, right? Because you're going to have to work with that person and build a sense of trust with them so that they feel, whatever information you're giving has some truth to it. And then start to give the person experiences that it's possible to actually change this. I know that's been very common in the pain science world, the clinical side, not so much the yoga side, but the clinical side of when a person has these misconceptions about pain, of sort of sitting them down and talking to them and teaching them about this, which I think is one way that you can help people understand pain in a new way. But part of the reason I love yoga is because yoga gives you multiple experiences with which to change the pain, right? So you can see, well, what happens if we change breath? What happens if we change body alignment? What happens if we change, how hard you push, or if we change muscle tension or body awareness? There's so many different things we do within yoga. And if you have this ongoing pain and this belief that it's all to do with the tissue, and we find a technique that actually gives you a different experience, right? So you were expecting that this is, that nothing was going to happen, but something now positive has happened. Now, that's way more powerful at changing your beliefs than me just telling you that it's possible to change pain. I also want to go back to the idea that when we're talking about changing pain, we do not know if the person we are, or the person sitting in front of us, how much they can, because we don't know the DNA that they have. We don't know what's happened to them in this life that will affect the way that their cells work and their systems work. We just don't know how much is this individual able to produce the chemistry that would actually start to change pain.
Hmm.
Um, and I would say I've even met people who, um, well, who commonly come back to me and say, I tried that technique that we did, in your office or in the studio, and it worked, but I tried it at home and it really didn't work. And you go back and you try it with a person again, and they're doing it all right, and they're saying to you, well, it actually sort of works again now. And so what this actually may be happening is that this person may need the support of somebody else's autonomic nervous system for
Mm-hmm.
them to get the changes that are required to actually make this change happen. And I pointed out because in the area of pain management, um, pain care is everyone says it's got to be individualized, which is great. Except as we made it more individualized, we took out the group process.
Mm,
So we made it into something that I teach you how to do and you do on your own, rather than teaching you how to do this in a group, which comes back to why is one of the other reasons I think mindfulness and yoga is so helpful is because you usually do it in a group of other people. And there's a growing research into stuff called autonomic synchrony, where
mm.
your autonomic processes are syncing up with the people around you to give you some support. Um, and so although we want it to be that everybody, we just teach some of these techniques, they'll be able to go home and do them and get benefit. It's possible that any particular individual may never in this lifetime be able to get really good changes without doing it with other people, which isn't so bad, right? Because it actually means you need to get out there and be with other people.
I think that's really interesting. And maybe it's a both and, because there's definitely that argument that, it needs to be an individualized recipe for each person and a process that makes sense for them as the unique human being they are. That makes sense. But to anyone who has been in group yoga classes or group meditation experiences, you know what we're talking about, this feeling of that group energy and the support that it creates
Mhm.
when we practice together. So to think about that as applying to learning how to manage pain and working with these techniques as pain care processes is really interesting, that
Mhm.
there's some benefit to that, to doing it together, and to borrowing a little bit of someone else's calm for your nervous system so you can
Exactly.
learn that. That's really
Yeah.
interesting.
If I could go back to you were talking about the language. I think the one other language thing we need to be careful of is that sometimes when we learn how much the nervous system is involved with pain and protection, that we start to express to people that that's what the problem is when pain persists. It's the nervous system.
Hmm.
And if we never talk about the body anymore, that's pretty much guaranteeing the person's going to think that you're saying it's all in their head, which is probably
Right.
not your intention. And so I think it just becomes really important that whenever we're talking about persisting pain in the nervous system, that we always are talking about what we need to do is work on the body and to work on these nervous systems together, because that's going to get the best sort of way to move forward. But this sort of very dualistic language has crept in as people got so excited about the nervous system being something they could really change, and talking about the brain so much that the person in front of them is thinking, well, you are saying it's all in my head, right? If you're talking about my brain all the time. And so we actually see it within the communities around pain science and the research around this education, where they're starting to shift back to making sure that they're telling people we need to work on the body and we need to work on your nervous systems. We got to do both of these because you're not just a body and you're not just a nervous system.
And this is why you guys always say the pain is real, right? We're not saying the
Exactly.
pain isn't real. You're experiencing this sensation in your back or your knee, and it's very
Hmm.
real, even if there isn't tissue damage there at this point.
Yeah. And I mean, most people can understand that you can have pain when the tissue damage is gone. I mean, I would guess most people have been sort of cracked in the front of the shin or kicked in the front of the shin at some point in their life, enough so that months later, if they touch that spot, it still hurt, right? Months later, well, the tissue is healed, but it still hurts to touch it. And our best guess would be is that what happened was when you got banged in that spot, the nerves in the area have remained hypersensitive. For some reason, when you bang over the bone in certain spots on your body, like on your cheekbone or on the back of your forearm or in your shin, these spots, if you bang them on the bone, the nerves in the area tend to stay sensitive for a long time, long after the tissue is healed, which is sort of weird. Like if you bang other bones in your body, they just don't stay that sensitive for so long. But we've all had that.
Yeah, it is really interesting to think about that, how that hypersensitization could be the cause of a pain experience. And I think that's a piece where it gets interesting with this whole idea of, you want me to pay attention to my body, you want me to develop my interoception and be more in my
Hmm.
body, but my body hurts and it's really sensitive. So why would I want to do that? I
Mhm.
wonder if you could say something about that.
Yeah. This is an area that has been really, really sort of consuming of my thinking for a long time because there's really not that much in the literature about the changes in the ability to feel the sensations of self when you have pain.
Hmm.
Um, but a lot of people, after they've had a cast on a broken arm or leg, when the cast comes off, they'll tell you the leg or the arm feels weird, right? It feels sort of big, or it feels heavy, or it feels something. And there's something about having, um, we'll just say, an abnormal sensation in part of your body that seems to provoke more pain. And that's the piece that uh, I really hesitate in saying anything about because we don't know what that is. But if after pain, or so when we have an area where there's pain, sometimes if we try to pay attention to that part of our body, we can't feel the non-pain sensations of it.
Mm-hmm.
All we can feel is the pain there. Or sometimes we take our attention there and that part of our body feels like it's bigger than it's supposed to be, or swollen, or it feels like it's really small or vague. Or in some even more cases, some people say it feels like it's missing. So a
Mm.
patient I was working with a couple of days ago, I was getting them to do this sort of pelvic rocking position from a bit of a twist. And he's like, okay, it's like I can't feel my low back right now. If I put him on
Hmm.
his hands and knees and rocked his pelvis back and forth, he could feel it. But when we shifted to this position, he said, it's like it's gone.
Wild.
And there's, yeah, so it's, all the stuff depends on context, and position is definitely a context, right?
Hmm.
Anyway, um, I think for a lot of people who have ongoing pain, there's a disruption of being able to feel the subtle non-pain sensations of self. And there's something about that that seems to drive ongoing pain. And when you
Mm-hmm.
can get people to be able to feel the subtle non-pain sensations of self, that in doing so, that starts to decrease the intensity of the pain. And I haven't seen studies on this yet. It's just something we've been teaching people for, like 20 years to do this. And so many people have come back and said, yeah, this is working. That as I start to be able to feel the subtle non-pain sensations of my body, that the pain intensity is going down. And that the more they do it, the more the pain intensity goes down, which is, um, I haven't been able to find the neuroscience yet to explain it.
It makes a lot of sense from a yoga and mindfulness perspective, but
Yes.
it definitely does, because like pain by definition is like a loud, intense, high priority sensation. So it's going to drown out other types of sensations. And I'm sure the longer that goes on, that's training our system to perceive it more and more and to deprioritize other types of sensations. So these practices we do, where we make a practice of feeling sensations, neutral ones, pleasant ones, and unpleasant ones as well. We give ourselves that opportunity for more context and to feel, what is working, what is whole. Or, Thich Nhat Hanh, he would always talk about being appreciative of non-toothache when you don't have a toothache, to be grateful for non-toothache.
So many great things that Thich Nhat Hanh shared with us.
So much wisdom. And so in this process of beginning to turn towards the pain and beginning to move, amidst
Mhm.
pain experience, um, I think when we've had a lot of pain, or we've had an area that's experienced some pain, fear comes up quite
Mhm.
naturally. One of the things you guys talked about in the training was cultivating fearlessness. And I loved this because, it does take courage to re enter a part of the body that's had, some trauma or some pain. And it does take courage to begin to move again around that. So, can you say a few words about cultivating
Sure.
fearlessness?
So we use that term a little bit to be a little bit provocative,
I think it
because
is.
yeah, because it's fearlessness, right? Sort of gives you this idea of having no fear whatsoever, which we think is a really interesting aspiration, or maybe not a great aspiration. But what we're actually thinking about is, if you have ongoing pain and you move and there's an increase in pain, that means that the protective mechanisms of you are determining that this is a dangerous thing to do. We know that when pain persists, that the nervous system has become more sensitive. It's responding in a bigger way, responding more easily in a bigger way. And so when you move and there's an increase in pain, this is probably an indication of this sensitivity to the nervous system. And again, the name Lorimer Moseley comes up because he started with this idea of asking, when you get to that spot where the pain gets a little bit more, is this dangerous really? Or is this really dangerous? And so we started to play around with this a little bit more, and we started to ask people to, when they're moving, to do it in a way where they're keeping their breath as calm as they can, keeping their body tension as low as they can, and keeping their mind calm. And so if you can keep your breath calmer, your body calmer, and your mind calmer, then there's going to be less evidence of danger or more evidence of safety. And of course, if there is, then there will be less fear. So it's like this process is a process to cultivate less fear with movement, is to go through this, calm your breath, calm your muscle tension, calm your mind. And the way you calm your mind that we've talked to people about is the idea of asking themselves, is this safe for my body to do this movement? And then the other question is, will I be okay later? And so if you are answering those questions appropriately, then that's calming the mind. And you will become more fearless when you actually can do these things, because it actually will be less painful when you do them. But the other thing that happens around the fearlessness is that when you start to realize that you can actually change it, then that sense of self-efficacy or that confidence you get when you can actually change this more, then again, that is also going to increase courage or increase or decrease fear.
So it's a very gentle process of deliberately moving towards, or maybe even allowing some pain within a movement for purposes of practicing calming your nervous system and your breath and your
Mm-hmm.
thoughts, because that builds confidence and capacity.
Yeah. Yeah. When you do this, when you go to that spot where there is more pain and you can calm things down, the idea is, well, if it was really dangerous, you wouldn't be able to calm your breath. You wouldn't be able to calm your body. You wouldn't be able to calm your mind, all that stuff together. So it must be less dangerous than your system is saying. So let's just
Mm-hmm.
keep on going there. And as you said, the idea is to continue to go there and challenge that edge. And when you challenge the edge, the systems of you are saying, hey, this is dangerous. And what you do is you come along and say, well, is it? Right? And part of the way you ask the question is you actually ask the question cognitively, but then you ask the question with your breath, like, can I calm my breath? And you ask the question with muscle tension, can I calm my muscle tension? And if you can do all those things, that's evidence that it's not so dangerous. And so then you've realized you can go further. And so, as you said at the beginning, it's gentle. Like at the beginning, you're going to this very gentle edge, but as time goes on, you start to learn that you can push further in and you'll be okay. The problem is that when you do that at the beginning, because the system is so sensitized that, you sort of push in there, it gets cranked up, and when you stop, it doesn't come back down again because you weren't working on your breath and your body tension.
You have to titrate this.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. And, one of the things I learned was that you said the pain alarm goes off well before you're actually damaging your tissues. So you have
Hmm.
some room there to experiment and to build this capacity if you know that you're not hurting yourself the second you get that
Hmm.
indication of warning.
Yeah, there's always a buffer between where the pain increases and when damage will happen. And the good news, bad news of chronic pain is that the buffer is way bigger. The good news part of that is that when you get to the spot where the pain increases, you're a long way away from tissue injury. The bad news of that is that that means that the alarm system is turning on really soon. And
Hmm.
so what we need to do, as you said, is we need to sort of go and nudge into it gently and over time go further and further and further with the specific intent, which sounds really weird, of making the buffer smaller. But you want to make it smaller again, because when you make the buffer smaller, then you can move more and your body will be protecting you a more appropriate amount.
Not overprotecting you.
Yeah.
So you no longer have to walk on eggshells with that particular kind of movement.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's so helpful to think about. And particularly for those of us who lead movement practices, and, no teacher wants to invoke pain in their
hmm
classroom. But if we can know that pain will occur in our classroom because we're teaching human beings, and that
hmm
that's okay if we have tools to work with that, I think that's a really helpful perspective rather than always trying to avoid any
hmm
pain.
I agree. I think the idea that pain has become taboo, or we read some in some places around yoga that if there's pain, it's not yoga. But you know, everybody has pain during asana, and everybody has pain as they sit in meditation. Right? If you stay still long enough, if you move far enough, you will get some pain. It's okay. But that's the piece that's missing, is the answer to the question of how much pain is okay. And what we've recognized from everything the pain science has told us and with working with a lot of people is that you can't actually answer that question directly, because pain is always multifaceted. It's this complex thing. And you can't just use the pain as your guide because it's not accurate enough,
Hmm.
which is the idea of why we came along and said, well, instead of just using your pain as a guide for how hard to push, why don't we use your pain, your breath, your muscle tension, and your mind? So now you're listening to 4 alarm systems, which is going to give you more accurate information. In the rehab world, some people say to us, somebody told me that I should use my pain as my guide for how much to exercise. And invariably, when people are told that, it doesn't work, which would make sense because it's not an accurate guide. Whereas if we can bring in more alarm systems and use basically the practices of yoga to become more discerning, right? To give a person an opportunity to explore their breath, their muscle tension, their mind, and the pain. And to do that in this safe container of controlled movements, and then slowly start to sort of push on the container, right? To move more, or to do these things in more challenging positions. That's where you start to get the nice lasting changes.
That's so fascinating. And this has been such a rich and helpful conversation. Thank you so much for your time today. Would you like to share with people where they can find more of your work, learn more from you, what you've got coming up, where to follow you, all that stuff?
Sure. Well, the simple thing is to go to paincareaware.com. So paincareaware.com. And from there, there's a tab that has all the courses, and we have like the course you took, Adi, the foundations course, which is an evergreen course. We actually have another a shorter course than that now that's called an introduction course. So we have those. We also have a whole sort of ladder of education above that. We have certificate courses in yoga and pain science for anyone who's interested in that. Should mention also on the paincareaware.com website, there's a resource tab that has a whole bunch of free articles that we've written, access to other free stuff that will help people who have chronic pain. And if anybody wants to see, we don't have on our website, we don't have any really good, really gentle videos, but there's a website called Pain BC. So just PAINBC.ca. And if you go on there and you look for gentle movement at home, at the beginning of the pandemic, we recorded 37, 30 or 40-minute really gentle movement practices at home. And you can hear all the language that we talked about here today. You can hear it in the ones that I read there.
Wow, that sounds like an amazing resource. Well, cool. I'll put all the links to these resources for sure in the show notes so people can find them.
Great.
But thank you again for sharing so much knowledge today. I think this will be an excellent way for people to get to know this topic of pain and pain care a little bit better.
hmm Yeah, it's a great start. I'd encourage everyone to dip your toe in and then keep on going, because it's the kind of topic that's so complex that you really can't learn it in a weekend course. You have to keep on working and see how it works with the people you serve.
Absolutely. And I think it's continuing to evolve as the science evolves.
Hmm.
So it's a big, big topic and a really important one. Thanks again, Neil.
Oh, thanks you. It's great to be here.
So that's today's episode. If you enjoyed this conversation, please share it with a friend, subscribe on YouTube, or leave us a review on Apple Podcasts and help others find it that way. To learn more about my work, the Moved to Meditate class library, courses, or teacher trainings, go to movedtomeditate.yoga. This is Addie D. Hilster. Thanks so much for listening.